Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight, we're delving into the campground for a collection of scary stories. Don't forget to drop a like, subscribe, and press the bell icon for more stories every day this week. But for now, let's get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I always hated going camping. My parents sent me to summer camp in Colorado every year, and each visit involved at least one camping trip into the woods. Despite the brevity of these trips, I always resented them. The heavy bag, the lack of toilets, and the spiders that inevitably found their way into my tent. However, when I turned 16 and became a camp counselor in training, my distaste briefly changed. At that age, we were only a few years older than the oldest campers, but we were given considerable leeway in what we were allowed to do. Most nights, we had to stay in the cabin with our campers, but it was rumored that the camping trip was a time where the counselors in training would get drunk, smoke weed, and hook up with each other after everyone else went to sleep. What I didn't know, however, was that the events of the camping trip would dissuade me from ever going camping in the woods again. The trip began like any other. Altogether, there were around 30 people on the trip. 4 counselors in training, 4 counselors, and around 20 or so boys and girls between 13 and 14, walking in single file, lined up and down the various trails. You could hardly hear any sounds of nature over the conversation and laughter of the campers. Several hours passed as we made our way through a dense, marshy area and an upper steep incline populated with evergreens and aspens. I wasn't the most athletic kid, so it was around this point that I found myself at the back of the line with one of the other counselors in training, Jordan, as well as 2 campers who were also struggling to keep up. The 4 of us started chatting, and in our distracted state, we began to fall more and more behind the rest of the campers until the last of them faded out of view around a bend about 50 feet up. Unconcerned, we kept walking at the same slow pace. After half an hour or so, the trail started to level off, and I began to feel increasingly anxious. Not only had the rest of the group disappeared ahead of us, but we had entered a stretch of completely dead evergreens, half of which looked scorched by wildfire, and the other half appeared to have died from disease. The eeriness of the landscape was punctuated by a small, derelict cabin sitting in the middle of the scorched forest, seemingly untouched by the fire that must have spread through the area. We were so enthralled by this scene that one of the campers screamed when a twig broke behind us. Jordan and I started laughing a bit, but we quickly stopped when we turned to look at where the sound had come from. Not 20 feet behind us was a haggard-looking man with a messy nest of black hair and a long black beard, slowly making his way up the trail with his eyes locked on us. He didn't appear to have any hiking supplies on him, and we had no idea how long he had been walking behind us. Being young, we were naturally pretty freaked out, but Jordan managed to give the guy a slight wave before saying to the rest of us, "Come on, let's speed up and get back to the rest of the group." As we turned to continue our way up the path, the man mumbled a question that was hard to hear. I was shocked when Jordan turned around to ask the man to repeat himself. The man uttered again, slightly louder, "Going camping?" Jordan answered that yes, we were going camping, to which the man smiled slightly before stating in a creepy and ominous voice, "Best be careful." We nodded and gave a heartfelt thank you, and were on our way. This time at a much faster pace. We began finding the rest of the group, and although the man had been walking up the same trail as us, when we saw him, he didn't continue. Instead, he just stood there in the middle of the trail, watching us as we made our way up the winding path, eventually vanishing from his view. Finally, we caught up with the rest of the group, who had been waiting for us. We told the adult counselors about our interaction with the strange man. They just shrugged it off, telling us the guy probably lived in that cabin and just wanted to know what we were doing near his property. But the unsettling feeling lingered, and the atmosphere had changed as we continued our journey into the depths of the woods. Still, I felt unnerved by the encounter, and when we finally arrived at the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had somehow followed us. Eventually, though, I put it to the back of my mind and managed to enjoy myself a bit. Everyone else had gone to bed, and Jordan and the other counselors in training from the boys' cabin had brought 2 warm Mike's Hard Lemonades that they had stolen from the counselors' quarters. I had taken out a joint that I had stashed away for this exact occasion to avoid getting in trouble. We decided to hike out into the woods a bit to smoke the joint, and made our way to the edge of the river, where we had washed our pots and pans earlier in the day. The spot was eerily silent, and the thought of the man from earlier kept coming into my head. Assuming that I was cold, not anxious, Jordan gave me his blue hoodie. This prompted one of the other girls to suggest that we switch tents for the night so that I could sleep in the same tent with him, and she could sleep in the same tent as the other boy. I had absolutely no problem with this, and after smoking the joint, we made our way back to our tents, which were pitched slightly away from the others. We discreetly sipped on the Mike's Hard Lemonades while telling scary camping stories. Some time passed, and one of the boys was in the middle of telling a rather muddled story that he was clearly making up on the spot when he suddenly stopped. In the silence, we could hear what sounded like footsteps crunching on pine needles about 40 feet away, near one of the other camper tents. As we strained to listen to what was going on, the noises stopped, even though we assumed it was just one of the campers getting up to use the bathroom. Being stoned and hyped up from the scary stories, we decided to call it a night and go hide in our tents. Jordan followed suit, and we awkwardly made out before eventually going to sleep. I don't know what time it was, but it must have been quite late when I suddenly woke up to the distinct sound of footsteps walking around near my tent. Shot with adrenaline, I tried to lay as still as possible and quiet my breathing. From the sound, it was apparent that someone was less than 3 feet away from the front of my tent, seemingly pacing back and forth. I turned to wake up Jordan, but I was immediately put at ease when I saw that he wasn't next to me, assuming Jordan was the one I had been hearing. I closed my eyes, and I was just beginning to drift back to sleep when I heard the tent unzip. I felt Jordan lie down next to me, and after a few moments, he put his arms around me and began to spoon me. After nearly drifting off to sleep again, I realized I had to go to the bathroom and muttered something about having to go pee before beginning to unzip my sleeping bag. Seemingly annoyed by the noise, Jordan lazily turned over, pulling his hoodie over his head before going still again. Quietly, so as not to wake him, I unzipped the tent and quickly scanned the campsite for any movement. comforting myself that Jordan had just gone to pee and was fine. I put on my shoe. Both of us could see the clear outline of a man's shadow lying still in our tent. What happened next was a bit of a blur, but we ran into the pod of tents on the other side of the campground where the older counselors were sleeping. Frantically, we unzipped their tents and started yelling for them to come out, explaining that there was a man in our tent. I remember panic setting in as our counselors slowly and groggily woke up. But after some more frantic yelling, they finally understood the severity of the situation. A commotion broke out on the other side of our camp near our tent by the time they ran to the scene. They only found an unzipped tent and a bunch of our things scattered on the ground that the man had apparently knocked over or thrown during his escape. After that, we heard the counselors radioing back down to the camp to call the police, and we could tell that they were as scared as we were. I don't think any of us slept after that. Luckily, we only had to wait a few hours for the sun to come up. And by the time a few other counselors had arrived with guns to escort us back to camp, one of the other campers found Jordan's jacket tied around one of the trees on the path, like some kind of marker. Needless to say, he didn't want the hoodie back, and we just left it there. To this day, I can't say for certain that the man in the tent was the same guy we ran into on the trail, but his face and that night still haunt me. Last year, I went on a solo hike with my tent in Metz National Park in Germany. I hadn't really planned the route precisely. I just wanted to walk north. After walking through the forest for several hours, it was slowly getting darker. So I wanted to check Google Maps to see where the nearest place to camp was. Camping is prohibited directly in the national park forest. However, I had no reception there, which I had not considered beforehand. I walked on for a while and eventually came to a small settlement in the middle of the national park. There were maybe 5 houses and a small chapel right next to a small cemetery. Since the sun was slowly setting and I needed a place to camp, I decided to ask someone who lived there. An old man was sitting in one of the gardens in front of the houses, and I explained my situation to him. He offered me to sleep on the meadow next to the cemetery. Since I had no other option, I graciously accepted the offer. I set up my tent there, made myself comfortable, and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up to a child's voice. I sat up abruptly, initially thinking I'd only dreamt it. That if you have encountered something similar, or if you feel unsafe, it's important to contact local authorities. As I attempted to wind down in the back, leaning against the side window behind the passenger seat with my legs outstretched to the car's back door, I noticed the opposite window was rolled down slightly, letting in a cold breeze. Engrossed in my phone, scrolling through Facebook, I suddenly heard something outside. A few crunches of fallen leaves several paces away from the car. I whispered to my friend, "Did you hear that?" But she was already out. Putting my phone down, I listened intently for a minute or two, but there was nothing. It must have been a small animal curious about the camp. I went back to my phone, scrolling through social media, and about 10 minutes had passed when I heard it again. A crunch right outside the door. Lowering my phone, my eyes took a moment to adjust from the light of the screen into the deep darkness of the woods. As I turned the phone away from me, the backlight illuminated the window above my feet. To this day, I can't get the image out of my head. 2 dirty, scabbed hands held onto the window, fingers wrapped inside the car. The nails were long, unkempt, and dark. behind the window. A silhouette of a face was pressed up against it, breath creating condensation every few seconds, and all I could make out were the reflections of those empty, black eyes. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It felt like an eternity. The staring contest between me and this thing. Thoughts were repeating incessantly in my head. Why haven't they run away when I noticed them? What were they planning? Was it the face of death? After probably 10 seconds of not doing anything, the hand slowly unclenched the window and receded into the darkness. The condensation on the window disappeared, and a few seconds passed before I heard the dreaded crunch melodically fading into the distance. I still just sat there. What the hell just happened? Why didn't I do anything? Why am I still not doing anything? With that thought, my body shot into adrenaline. I pounded on my friend's seat, waking her up from a slumber in a dizzy confusion. I unlatched and kicked open the door, taking a moment to scan the area. Whoever they were, whatever it was, I scrambled to pick up any important camping supplies we left outside and crammed everything into the back seat and trunk, periodically looking over my shoulder, listening for those footsteps. I slammed the back door shut, and there they were, a grim reminder of the horror that had just happened. 2 handprints imprinted on the window. I quickly wiped them off the window in a panic, a reaction to erase the evidence, I guess. I jumped into the front seat, started the car, and floored out of there. My friend finally coming to and asking me what the hell I'm doing. We've got to go. Someone's out there. I didn't see whatever or whoever it was while fleeing the scene, speeding down the dirt road. My friend insisted I slow down, and eventually I did. We reached the highway, and I proceeded to drive 20 or so miles before we reached Denny's. My friend asked for us to stop and eat, and for me to explain everything. The nightmare subsided a few months later, but my embarrassment continues to this day for the state of shock I was in at the time. Everyone says you either have a fight or flight instinct, and I'm confused whether I have either. I mean, I just sat there and did nothing. I guess mine was freeze. I frequently tend to ask myself, who was out there? Another camper messing with us? A resident of the abandoned cabin down the dirt road? Or maybe something more paranormal lurking in the forest, watching lone, vulnerable campers as they drift off to sleep. In the years ahead, we would still go camping there, but never too far from the highway. Whatever it was, I hope that was the last I ever saw of it. In the early morning, just as the first light was breaking, we had been vigilant, taking turns keeping watch throughout the night, occasionally hearing distant screams, but they gradually faded away. Ty stumbled into our campsite, disheveled and clearly shaken. His eyes were wide, and he looked more terrified than threatening. We cautiously approached him, asking if he was okay. He didn't seem to recognize us at first, but after a moment of confusion, he started to remember the events of the night. He explained that he had lost all sense of reality during his bad trip, and the forest had become a labyrinth of horrors. He recounted seeing grotesque figures, hearing unsettling whispers, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. He believed he was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the effects of the mushrooms gradually wore off, Ty became more coherent. He apologized profusely to Gary, expressing deep remorse for his actions. Gary, though still wary, seemed to empathize with Ty's terrifying experience. We all decided to pack up and leave the campground together. not wanting to linger in a place that had turned into a surreal battleground the night before. Throughout the hike back to the car, Ty kept glancing nervously into the woods, haunted by the lingering memories of his psychedelic ordeal. Gary, while forgiving, remained vigilant, ensuring that Ty did not pose any threat during our journey back. Once safely in the car and on the way to civilization, Ty continued to apologize and express gratitude for our help. Gary, in a surprisingly compassionate move, offered to drive Ty to a nearby town where he could get assistance or find someone to pick him up. The bizarre encounter in the woods left us with a mix of emotions. Relief that no one was seriously harmed, a sense of astonishment at the unpredictability of psychedelics, and a shared acknowledgement of the fine line between a mind-altering experience and a potential descent into madness. As we drove away from the campground, leaving behind the echoes of screams and surreal events, we couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had played host to a nightmarish drama, one that defied the boundaries of reality and tested our understanding of the thin veil between sanity and chaos. The shadows of that night lingered in our memories, a cautionary tale about the unpredictable nature of psychedelic journeys in the vast expanse of the wilderness. I can't see the entire area due to the embankment, so I move to the side to get a better view. As I shine my flashlight upwards, I catch a glimpse of movement in the darkness above. There, on the bridge, I see a figure quickly retreating. Feeling a chill down my spine, I freeze for a moment. My mind races with possibilities, and I start considering if it's just a mischievous person or something more sinister. I decide to call out, trying to appear unfazed. "Hey, who's up there? What are you doing?" No response. The figure continues to retreat, disappearing from view. Now I'm not sure if this is a prank or something more alarming. I cautiously make my way back up the trail, keeping an eye on the bridge. As I approach the top, I notice the lamps on the bridge flicker, casting an eerie glow. I reach my car, feeling a mix of unease and curiosity. Should I wait for my friends here, or should I go back down and investigate further? After a moment of contemplation, I decide to stay near my car, keeping the engine running. If anything happens, I can quickly leave or call for help. The minutes pass slowly, and my friends eventually arrive. I share the strange encounter with them, and we decide to check the area together. Armed with flashlights, we cautiously make our way down the trail. As we reach the campfire spot, everything seems normal. No signs of anyone or anything unusual. The unsettling feeling lingers, but we still decide to have our campfire, trying to shake off the unease. The night goes on without further incidents, and we even manage to enjoy our time by the river. As the embers of the fire die down, we pack up our things, making sure not to leave any trace of our presence. We leave the area, our flashlights cutting through the darkness of the trail. The strange encounter remains a mystery, a chilling reminder of the eerie occurrences that can unfold in the quiet corners of the night. Logically, something must be falling into the water. I point the flashlight above, where some trees are over the river, and I don't see anything big enough to make a splash. As I keep digging, my heart pounding at this point, I hear a rustling past the arch of where the bridge goes over. I quickly grab my light and shine it towards the source of the sound, calling out hello. There's no reply. In my head, I tell myself if it was a bear, I should be getting out of there immediately. However, there are no signs of a bear or anything else. I reassure myself that I'm just hearing things, influenced by horror movies. Yet, I hear the noise again. Unmistakably, the sound of leaves being rustled. I shine my flashlight over the area, and as I focus my eyes towards the illuminated spot, I see the naked back of a man hunched over. Anxiety and stress freeze me momentarily, because honestly, of all the things I expected to encounter, a naked man wasn't one of them. From a quick analysis, he appears to be in his mid-40s, shaved head, and a medium build, a mix between chubby and built. As my flashlight stays on his back, he starts to stand up, and the first thing I notice is that he isn't wearing any pants either. My reflex kicks in, telling me to pack up and get out of there. I convince myself that he's been throwing things into the water to scare me away. Utilizing my reflexive deductive skills, I speed walk out of there, carrying all my belongings. I briskly walk up the small ramp. And now, on the paved path out of the forest, I feel my heart pounding in my chest, frequently looking back to ensure I'm not being followed. I'm in Crocs, hoping sport mode would help if I need to sprint. I make it to the halfway point, and relief settles in, knowing I made it out safely. As I check behind me for the final time, I see something slowly creeping over the ramp. It's the naked man, crawling on all fours like a primate, his head positioned towards me. He gets up, standing on his feet, facing me. After this eerie transition, he starts running towards me, and I panic. I run as fast as I can down the path. My flashlight jumps out of my pocket, but I don't care. A naked man is chasing me at 11 p.m. in a secluded forest. I look back for a moment, and he's still running towards me, completely naked. He can have my flashlight for all I care. I just want to make it out alive. Finally, I reach the forest's edge, sprinting to my car, only 30 feet away, desperately fumbling with my key fob. I drop my keys, briefly thinking I'm actually dead. I brush off the thought, pick up my keys, and unlock my car, reflecting a classic horror movie scene. Unlocking the doors, I throw my things into the back seat before jumping into my car. It feels like an eternity, but in hindsight, it likely took no more than 6 seconds. As I guide the key into the ignition, I fixate on the end of the paved path where I was just seconds ago, waiting to see if the naked man is still coming. The key goes into the ignition, and I switch my focus to the road ahead. I zoom out of there as quickly as possible, driving away about 30 seconds from the horror scene. My phone rings. It's my friends, asking if I made it to the spot yet. All I say to them is, "Guys, do I have a crazy story to tell you?" They pull up to my house, as it was surprisingly close to the Campfire area, and I narrate the whole story. They all swear they weren't pranking me, and I believe them. I also knew they wouldn't sprint at me in the dark with their antics. While we're discussing the bizarre encounter in front of my house, a college student walks by, heading towards the direction where I encountered the naked man. I yell out, "Yo, be careful!" There's a naked guy that was chasing me by the bridge that crosses over the river. The student responds, "Oh, really? Damn, gotta go over that bridge to go home. Good luck, man." The next day, I report the incident to the police by phone, but they send an officer for an in-person account and to show them where it happened. When we revisit the spot where I initially saw the man's back hunched over, they claim they don't see any trace of anyone being there previously. The officer assures me they'll make a note of it in case it happens again. Some friends suggest it might be a cryptid, while others lean towards a more realistic explanation, such as a homeless or mentally ill person. I've never been a big fan of camping. Around 2012, my friend and I decided to take a Saturday night to camp on private property on the bank of a small lake in the rural American Southwest. The lake, more of a deep pond, was around 50 to 150 yards across, 5 times longer than its width. From our camp, it consumed the majority of our sideline. The plot of land wasn't entirely removed from civilization. Situated 5 to 10 miles outside a small suburb of a mid-sized southern city, however, it wasn't easily accessible, with the only entrance being a gated, narrow dirt road across a levee, which spanned one side of the lake. This road was gated and locked, and the owner provided us with the code. We pulled the car through, locking the gate behind us. Down south, isolation sets in quickly outside of cities. Our cities are small, and rural areas are often rough and wild. Dense woods make it impractical for building, leading to pockets of untouched land. Going for a 30-minute drive out of town could bring you to cabins clearly off the grid. My friend and I, accustomed to suburban living, were simply happy to see the stars and hear the sounds of nature. At our utilitarian camp with small Coleman tents, we set up for the night. I sat in the tent, wrapped in a blanket, simply enjoying the night, when suddenly my buddy sat up straight. "Hey, do you see that guy over there?" He pointed to the other side of the small lake. I didn't see anything initially, and I responded, "Nah, it's just the dark playing tricks on you." He seemed shaken, insisting, "Nah, look, there are a bunch of faces behind the trees." Now fully intrigued, I sat up, rubbing my eyes to gain full focus. And then I saw them, small, round, white faces staring back at me from across the lake. Maybe 15 to 20 of them. They were positioned in a way that their bodies were behind the trees, and only their heads were visible. The best way I can describe their faces is like very pale, somehow internally illuminated children. Neither of us was drinking or high. We were too young for that. We had dinner at home and were just planning on going to sleep and chilling out for a while. The faces weren't moving, and I sat there in shock, thinking that my eyes would adjust and realize it was a reflection, bugs or owls. But that realization never came. I stared right back at them for what felt like 5 minutes, looked back at my friend, and they were gone. Bodies of water carry sound extremely well, and we heard excessive shuffling from the other side of the lake, along with a few small branches snapping. It's incredible what your ears pick up during an otherwise silent night. My buddy was tearing up when he said, "What the hell are those?" I didn't have a good answer, and neither of us slept particularly well. I felt validated in my feelings of disliking camping. But what could we do? I tried to research on the internet, but I never found a plausible explanation for the phenomena. If anyone else has experienced something similar, I'd love to hear it. Now, switching to another story, back in the spring of 2018, I had an experience while camping in the Francis Marion and Sumter National Forest. I'm an avid outdoorsman and took my young son and dog to a remote area to test out a new camper shell on my truck. Around 11 p.m., my dog growled, and I saw what appeared to be hundreds of small white balls of light darting around, hovering, and slowly converging toward our campsite. They looked like the dust orbs seen in videos, but produced light in a completely dark forest. forest. These soft white lights surrounded my truck, seeming to number in the hundreds. They didn't blink like lightning bugs. And after about half an hour of floating around and concentrating around us, I finally worked up the nerve to open the truck. I lit a lantern, and they promptly disappeared. After turning off the lights and locking up, they returned. My son was fast asleep, and I watched them until around 1 a.m. The next morning, when we tried to leave, the battery on my new truck was dead. And a week later, I had to replace the electric control module. Not sure if it's relevant, but I thought I'd add it anyway. I'm curious if anyone has had a similar experience. Experienced in Norway left me very confused, and I just wish I knew what it was. Years ago, during a camping trip in Norway to celebrate a friend's birthday, we planned to hide gifts in a small hedge maze near our campsite to make the opening more fun. The night before, in the pitch-black darkness illuminated only by the moonlight, I volunteered to hide the gifts. The adults allowed me since the maze was close by, and not that big, only about 20 meters across. As I hid the gifts, everything seemed normal. However, on my way out, I made the mistake of looking into the edge of the heavily wooded forest. I noticed an odd shape that seemed to move more than its surroundings. The slight wind caused the plants to move slightly, but this shape appeared humanoid. After just a few seconds, the shape abruptly moved, as if it were suddenly facing me. Strangely, whatever it was didn't have a face. It was simply flat. It's challenging to convey just how terrified I was in that moment. At the age of 11, alone in the dark, only 5 minutes away from the rest of the campers, it felt like freezing water had been poured all over my body. My heart felt like it had stopped, and without hesitation, I bolted out of there, running all the way back to the camp. I explained what I had seen, but unsurprisingly, none of the adults believed me. However, my friend and some other kids did, which wasn't surprising given our shared interest in haunted stories. The next morning, I mustered the courage to return to the same place and explored the forest around it with other kids. I didn't see anything out of place, but I did find a small spot where the grass looked squished, as if someone or something had been standing there. It was around the area where I saw the strange shape. Thinking about it in hindsight, I am still left puzzled by the experience. Have never done that, and it remains an unsettling memory. The creature I saw that night was likely just a plant moving in the wind, but even years later, I vividly recall the jerky movement as it turned to look at me, presenting a completely featureless face. It may sound trivial, but trust me, the memory is haunting. On a different note, my buddies and I embarked on a fishing camping trip at a remote lake, accessible via a 4x4 trail about 2 hours from home. There were 4 of us, all men, with me being the smallest at 195 pounds. The camping spot was great for fishing, with a deep area filled with trout nearby. However, the campground itself was rough, situated on the side of a steep hill, offering barely enough room for tents and a small fire ring. To reach the camp, you had to navigate a rough, steep, winding 100-yard trail from where you parked your 4x4 above. After a day of beer drinking and successful fishing, we enjoyed a small fire and chatted the night away. Suddenly, a blinding light shone in our faces from about 10 yards away. We heard no approach, and the person announced themselves as the sheriff when questioned by one of my friends. The stranger didn't respond further, just shining the light in our faces again before saying, "Have a good night," and walking off. Dumbfounded, we sat there, wondering what had just happened. After a moment, curiosity got the better of us, and I used my powerful flashlight to illuminate the person about 50 yards away, right before the crest of a bend in the trail. Before disappearing from sight, we all saw that he was just some guy in a flannel shirt and jeans. Definitely not a sheriff. He might have heard me, as we saw him move quickly for a second before disappearing. Shortly after, we heard an engine start, which was odd since we hadn't heard a vehicle earlier. We attributed that to our drunken and loud state. What makes this incident unsettling is the thought of what could have happened if it wasn't 4 big guys he approached. What if it was a single person or a couple? What were his intentions? Should we have chased after him? It's debatable. Should we have reported it to the actual sheriff's department? Absolutely. Unfortunately, we never did, leaving the incident lingering as a disconcerting memory. I was still staring straight ahead, unresponsive. I shook her gently, but she didn't react. I called out her name, but there was no response. It was as if she was in some kind of trance. Worried, I turned to Cassie, who was equally puzzled. We exchanged concerned glances, trying to figure out what was happening. The atmosphere in the trailer felt heavy, and an eerie silence enveloped us. Suddenly, Jennifer snapped out of her trance, as if nothing had happened. We bombarded her with questions, but she seemed confused and couldn't remember anything. It was unsettling, but we tried to dismiss it, as maybe she was just sleepwalking or experiencing a strange dream. Despite the weird occurrences, we decided to continue with our camping trip, convincing ourselves that it was just our imagination playing tricks on us. The next day, we explored the surrounding woods and enjoyed the beautiful nature around us. However, an unsettling feeling lingered in the air. That evening, as we gathered around the campfire, we noticed the cupcakes we had left on the table the night before were gone. It was odd, but we shrugged it off, thinking maybe an animal had gotten into the trailer. As the night fell, we heard strange noises again, whispers in the distance, rustling leaves, and that peculiar scream from the previous night. The unease settled in, and we huddled closer together, trying to shake off the growing fear. Throughout the night, strange things continued to happen. Shadows moved on their own, and we caught glimpses of figures that vanished when we looked directly at them. Cassie, who had been cooking earlier, claimed she saw a figure standing outside the trailer, but couldn't make out any details. Eventually, we decided to pack up and leave the next morning, cutting our camping trip short. The strange occurrences had taken a toll on all of us, and the feeling of being watched never subsided. As we left the campground, I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that something had followed us. To this day, we talk about that camping trip, trying to make sense of the inexplicable events that unfolded in the woods. It remains a mysterious and eerie memory, forever etched in our minds. In that moment, we felt intense fear and uncertainty as we ran in the opposite direction. At the time, we weren't sure who those people were or what they were doing in the middle of the woods. Looking back, we realized they were probably just a group of people engaged in some kind of medieval role-playing, or perhaps just having a good laugh. In that moment, however, the experience was genuinely frightening. Now, with the passage of time, my dad, his friend, and I laugh about that peculiar encounter. It serves as a reminder of how perspectives can shift, and what seemed inexplicable or eerie at the time can later become a humorous anecdote. Camping experiences, with their blend of nature and unexpected encounters, can indeed leave lasting impressions that evolve over time. Despite the initial fear, the memory now brings amusement, highlighting the unpredictability and richness of outdoor adventures. And with that, the camping trip story concludes. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, you can let me know below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories every day. A special thanks to my members and patrons, whose names you can see on screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, stay awesome and see you soon. In that moment, we felt intense fear and uncertainty as we ran in the opposite direction. At the time, we weren't sure who those people were or what they were doing in the middle of the woods. Looking back, we realized they were probably just a group of people engaged in some kind of medieval role-playing, or perhaps just having a good laugh. In that moment, however, the experience was genuinely frightening. Now, with the passage of time, my dad, his friend, and I laugh about that peculiar encounter. It serves as a reminder of how perspectives can shift, and what seemed inexplicable or eerie at the time can later become a humorous anecdote. Camping experiences, with their blend of nature and unexpected encounters, can indeed leave lasting impressions that evolve over time. Despite the initial fear, the memory now brings amusement, highlighting the unpredictability and richness of outdoor adventures. And with that, the camping trip story concludes. If you enjoyed tonight's tales, you can let me know below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories every day. A special thanks to my members and patrons, whose names you can see on screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Until next time, stay awesome and see you soon. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed tonight's camping stories. If you found them intriguing, or if you have your own eerie camping tales to share, let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories every day. A huge shout out and heartfelt thanks to my members and patrons whose names you see on screen. Your support makes these stories possible, and I truly appreciate it. If you're interested in extra content and more perks, check out the membership and Patreon links. As we wrap up these camping chronicles, remember that sometimes the scariest moments in the great outdoors can become the most amusing stories with time. Stay awesome, and I'll see you soon for more thrilling narratives.